think. I always feel like I look like a deer in the headlights when I start. It's those big googly eyes. It's 10:55, so I'm going to just sit here for a little while, make sure everything's set up correctly, switch a little bit between cameras, make sure that everything is up and running. And when you arrive, if you arrive, will you please just drop me a note either on Facebook underneath this live video? Just drop me a note saying that the audio's good, you can hear me, you can see the video, and that little bit of feedback just assures me that everything is set up correctly. So it is 10:56, and let me see. Looks like everything is as it should be. I'm going to type into, if you would like to, you can watch this on YouTube. I think the web address is youtube.com/C, the letter C, / Dabbleon Art, DABBLEON ART, Dabbleon Art. So it's also available on YouTube if that if that's easier for you. But Facebook works as well. All right, I think I am good. The one thing that I wish they would have somewhere in these things is just a little audio thing to make sure. Okay. So there's all these little things that you don't really think of when you're setting up for this or for something like this. At least I wouldn't have thought about them until I actually ran into them. And one of those things is audio. So I could put a headphone in and listen and make sure that it sounds good, but then usually there's a little bit of a delay. So if you're trying to talk and you hear yourself delayed, it then becomes very difficult to keep your train of thought and talk continuously. So there's always, I look forward to the day when it is a little bit more plug and play, a little bit easier. And I suppose I bring it upon myself because I do have perhaps more of a complicated setup than is strictly necessary. So maybe even if it was plug and play, I'd find a way to make it more complicated. All right. All right, I'm just going to give it one more minute here, and then I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think everything's good to go. 11 a.m., we're there. I like the idea of starting on time. So this is Thursday Live Critique. I am going to be doing these every Thursday at 11 a.m. You can find it here at facebook.com/Dabblon. That's DABBLEON .Trent, Dabblon.Trent. Or you can find me at Facebook. And I just said that. Or you can find me at YouTube, which is youtube.com/C/Dabblon Art. That's DABBLEONART. So that's YouTube. Ideally, in these live critiques on Thursday, I would like to be critiquing your work. So if you have an image of a painting or any kind of work of art that you're in the process of making or that you recently finished, ideally something that is recent, email it to me at Dabblon, that's DABBLEON, @gmail.com, and I will fit in as many images as I receive or that I can, and just go through, and I try to make this critique 45 minutes to an hour, no more than an hour. And the intention is to just give you some feedback. I think all of us, all artists that are in the studio by ourselves making art, it can be really difficult to see a way forward if you get stuck, or to really know if what you're creating is going to work, is going to be received in a way that you anticipate or that you want. So it's something that I enjoy doing, and happy to take a look at your artwork and talk about it here on the live critique. So send me your work. I'd love to see it. And I also feel inspired by seeing what other people are up to. And my hope is also that those that would watch this would also feel that momentum and that inspiration by seeing what other people are working on, and learn from common problems and things that we all run into in the process of creating stuff. So that is typically what I would like to be doing here on this broadcast, but it's also a good chance for me just to talk about some of the things that that I think about, some of the things that I care about, some of the things that I've kind of picked up over the years. I talked about Renoir a couple weeks back, and that got me thinking about some of my thoughts about a whole kind of artwork. Or maybe it's more accurate to say a reoccurring theme throughout a lot of art history. In fact, all the way back to cave paintings, right? To the earliest image making that we have available to us or that we're aware of. And I think there's a through line here that I see anyway, that I would like to try to tease out. And thinking about this and preparing for this, I guess I was a little worried that perhaps I was trying to address too large a topic and being too general. So I'm kind of trying to avoid that. So hopefully I'll be successful here. But I wanted to frame it in this simple statement that I come across regularly enough that I think it's something that we all have probably heard, and that is the statement, "My kid could do that," right? So why is this art? My kid could do that. Or I don't understand why this is of value. Why is it in an art history book? Why is it on a gallery wall? Why did somebody pay $10 million for that? My kid could do that, right? And that statement, and I think there's even I think there's a movie called "My Kid Could Paint That," and I've meant to watch it, but I have not gotten to it yet. But it's a fairly common sentiment, and I think there's a lot of things that are conflated in that sentiment, and I don't really want to go through and chronicle the different stages or genres and parts of art history that could be kind of, I don't know, see this trajectory of this kind of artwork and why things arrive on museum walls and why they're significant. I don't really want to talk to it from the point of view of an art historian. I'm sure there are books and papers and articles that are going to be that address it much more intelligently and thoroughly than I will here. Um, the the perspective that I feel like I can offer and that I would like to offer is that of a creator, right? Of somebody who makes artwork, who spends a lot of time with paintbrushes, with pencils, a lot of time looking at art, thinking about visual communication, thinking about visual design, um, and getting somebody who's like just cares deeply about it, feels deeply about it, right? So um, it's more of just a personal perspective on this on this history and these ideas. So take it for what it is. It's just some of my thoughts. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Google, and we're going to take a look at some of these things. I wanted to go through some artists that I commonly hear this statement. My kid could do that in response to, um, and then some of the reasons why I personally resonate with some of these artists that are commonly kind of uh, disregarded or discarded or kind of thrown off in that way, kind of tossed aside in that way. Okay, before I get started though, I wanted to mention this book. It's by Scott McCloud. And he's written several books about comics, but the book that I'm thinking about is Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics. And I think with regards to what I'm going to talk about today and some of my thoughts and ideas, I think this is a really, um, uh, it's a great book to read along these lines. He talks a lot about um, why comics are effective, why comic books are effective, why the simplification of the human form, how that makes it more accessible to a wider audience, um, and some of the ways that cartoons essentially are able to communicate more effectively even than highly realized, highly realistic rendered imagery. So he does a really good job of kind of giving visual examples and talking about these different phenomena in terms of human communication and our perception and image making. So I wanted to mention that. And then I also wanted to just frame it as well in terms of what art is trying to do. I mean, I think a lot of artists have different purposes, different reasons for creating art. But I think fundamentally, for me anyway, it's about expression, it's about communication, right? And that could be said of not just visual art, it could be said of music, it could be said of dance, of writing. Expression and communication, right? So if we were to take the same idea that my kid could do that, away from the context of visual imagery into a different kind or different creative realm, and let's just say, actually, let's just take it outside of creativity altogether. Let's just think of it in terms of expression, or think of expression and communication, right? So let's take it into an everyday setting. Let's say I come up to you. I come up to my friend and I say, "How's it going? How are you feeling?" And my friend says, "I'm not feeling so well," right? So I understand that. He's communicated, he's expressed himself, and I've received that communication. I understand it on a pretty, it's pretty literal, right? I get it. You've successfully communicated your message. But it's not very specific, right? And it doesn't really tap into a very direct, kind of essential, literal, physical kind of level on me, right? He's not feeling well, right? And then what if in that same situation I say, well, what's wrong? He said, oh, my stomach's upset, right? Okay, so that's a little bit more specific. I can relate to my own experiences in my life of when my stomach was upset, so I can have this kind of empathy or sympathy going on, and I can start to feel what it might be like for him to have an upset stomach, right? And then as we're talking, I hear his stomach go, right? So those noises, he didn't say anything, but his body made these noises. And now I've got a lot more information. There's a simplicity and a directness to that noise and that sound, right? So he, in a sense, he expressed himself, right, whether intentionally or not, in that way. And now that communication becomes it becomes something else, right? I can empathize, I can connect, I can understand in a much more visceral way, right? And then, of course, if he, all of a sudden starts puking in the bushes, then that's a whole nother level, right, of direct communication. So we went from something where it's like, I'm not feeling well, right? How you doing? Not feeling well. And then me looking over and he's puking in the bushes, right? And I feel like, again, expression, communication. I feel like this tendency we see in art history and even in contemporary art, and I think in all different fields, this tendency we have to appreciate kids' expression and the kind of mark making um, that certain groups have. Um, we connect with it at that level of seeing your friend puking in the bushes, right? There's something honest and direct and visceral and powerful about that level of communication. It's at a very like where the rubber meets the road kind of expression and communication that I think a lot of us find compelling in the kind of mark making that we see in kids art or primitivist or outsider or there's art brut. There's all these kind of terminology that we've come up with describing this, but essentially that's kind of what I feel like it gets at and the level or one way to be thinking about why some people find it so compelling. Okay, so that's another way that I wanted to frame my thoughts here is that I think expression, communication, that's what art making is about, right? That's what visual communication is about. And I think the reoccurrence in art history of different artists and groups of artists and art theorists and art historians finding this fascination with primitivist modes of expression or naive modes of expression is another term that I've heard used, or childlike or whatever, what have you. I think it's getting to that idea of it being a more pure, a more direct, a less filtered or modulated. As we get older, we're refined, where there are certain ways that we just can't act and things that we just can't say when we're in polite company, right? So we filter our feelings and our expressions through all these layers of culture and language and things that we pick up, and it loses the potency, the power of that very visceral, direct, baseline kind of expression, right? Anyway, so a couple artists here that are really well known that I'm going to mention. Paul Klee. I'll bring up a couple of his pieces. So let me open this in a new tab. Open image in a new tab and zoom in a little bit here. So very simplified houses. And then you have images like this. Let's take a look at that. Kind of simplified faces and shapes that, look like little animals or dinosaurs and little pie shapes. Fairly, a lot of these are unsophisticated color palettes. Kind of there's not too much order or sense to them. It feels very intuitive. Some of them are quite sophisticated, but bright colors, really high contrast. These lines are really thick and kind of clunky. The shapes are kind of standardized and evenly distributed. It's just kind of covered up. There's kind of a simplicity there, and some of the patterns that are used look like what you might see a kid do. So the critique is valid, right? My kid could do that. So maybe your kid could do something like this. In fact, it's often the case where kids will come up with something where you're like, wow, that's kind of amazing. Or kids will say something where that is so succinct and to the point and direct where it's really powerful and you're like, wow, I can't believe a kid just said that. Right? Or there's these ideas in religion like you should be more childlike, right? Be more like a child. Right? What does that mean? I think it's all kind of trying to get at the same idea. So Paul Klee is one of those. Jean Dubuffet. Now Jean Dubuffet, um, he's got some images like this. Actually, I'm going to bring this one up as probably a better example. Open image in new tab. So something like this, where it looks like a kid's simple drawing of their mom, right? So kind of a weird shape for the hair. Hands are kind of just sticks coming out of the hands. The eyes are really round. Um, the material itself is kind of mixed all together. These kind of really dirty kinds of colors and so there's an aesthetic there, right? Kind of a cartoony, simplified representation of a female. And I would say that that is something entirely different than some of the other work that he's probably best known for, these kind of large um, public sculpture type of things that are these big sculptural objects that have these line drawings on them. So stuff like this, right? In this case, it's simple. The aesthetic, very stylized, very simplified shapes and forms. But I don't think he's trying to mimic the aesthetic of a child drawing in this case. I think in this feels like a step in a different direction. This is a refinement. It is simplified. It is kind of generalized, but there's an intention there. It feels like he's coming up with a vocabulary of line and shape. He's coming up with an aesthetic that, while simple, is not really naive or childlike. It looks intentional. It looks refined, right? So that's something very different, and I don't think that is what I'm trying to get at here in this conversation or my thoughts here. So Paul Klee, Jean Dubuffet is another one. Picasso. So Picasso kind of famously, and a lot of these artists looked at the artwork that was coming out of Africa. So tribal masks and these other kinds of tribal masks were a big one, but other modes of representation coming out of Africa and this kind of tribal aesthetic. And they were incorporating some of that into their artwork. So again, kind of tying into something more pure, something less filtered, something less affected by the constraints of culture, of society, of training, of education, of all these things that get in the way or get in between us, how we feel, and being able to communicate that directly and effectively and powerfully, right? I think they recognize that. And then there's a lot of other stuff that could be said about what Picasso was doing. I also find it interesting with Picasso specifically that oftentimes when you hear people talk about Picasso, especially people that are not artists, art historians even, they'll talk about how accomplished he was, how much of a craftsman he was, how good at drawing and painting he was before he started doing these more childlike or naive or primitivist types of representation. So I feel like there's always this like, well, I don't know why this is good. I don't really appreciate the value of this, but we know it was on purpose. It wasn't just because he didn't know how to be a good artist. Like we've got proof that he knows how to draw. So it's used as a way to legitimize these more kind of primitivist types of rendering, which I think is just kind of silly. I think I understand the desire to try to legitimize something by appealing to merit, right? Like he's really good. He could do this other thing if he really wanted to, but he's choosing to do this. Um, I think there might be there's value in just recognizing that it is on purpose, right? It's intentional, so maybe it deserves your attention, knowing that somebody who's highly skilled is choosing to render in a more naive or simplified way. But I think it kind of misses the point and is a little bit irrelevant, right? I think, um, he could have gone straight to these things, and a lot of artists do go straight to these things that don't have the capacity to render something highly realistic in a mode, that you'd see in like, French or, classical French painting, or portraiture or whatever, like, whatever. Like, to me, it's kind of like saying like, this master chess player, you know, he's a real sportsman. He knows how to climb the tallest, most difficult mountains, but he's here playing chess, right? It's like, yeah, I mean, he's able to do this really difficult, challenging thing that requires a lot of skill, climbing mountains, but that really doesn't have anything to do with this activity of playing chess, right? It's they're kind of two different things, right? Or this person is writing haiku or or poetry, but he knows how to write really good fiction, right? So somehow that writing good fiction is like legitimizing the fact, like his simpler modes of communication, right? Anyway, I think you can kind of understand. Hopefully, I'm getting my point across, but um, it's irrelevant, so there's this other thing that I think is related, and again, I'm going to go through these artists that I get this response, like my kid could do that, and why is that significant, or doesn't kind of show craftsmanship in maybe a more traditional sense. Um, and this is another kind of related flavor to this conversation, and that is artists who are not appealing to a naive aesthetic in terms of like it being childlike, but rather they're appealing to a kind of a mode of representation that's trying to tap into mental illness, right? So there's this group of artists, and I think, again, this is across all creative fields, and I think even non creative fields, right? That we're looking at mental illness um, and seeing people who were able to not be constrained or held down by culture, by training, by all these ways that were kind of tamed and tempered, right? And normalized and systematized and brainwashed, right? Um, and the artist looked at the mentally ill as people who were able to break free of that, or who weren't bound by all those rules and could just express themselves more directly, right? And more honestly. There's an element, I think, or a desire to be more truthful in our communication, right? In our mark making, right? Like we don't want to see a mark that looks carefully considered when we're trying to communicate something that's more harsh and visceral and truthful, right? We want to see a big, right? We want to see a big mark that's aggressive, that's meaty, that feels like aggression, right? So I think Egon Schiele was somebody who looked at um, the mentally ill um, and tried to tap into some of that psychology. You can see it in how he kind of dehumanizes a little bit. The eyes are kind of distorted, um, and the facial expressions feel very kind of troubled and like you would see, somebody who is not mentally well or healthy, right? There's kind of expressions that feel troubled and disturbed in a way. And just some of the faces, you'll notice like the way the eyes are kind of left unrendered, or they're slightly askew, or the rest of the image is more polished, more rendered, and then the face is kind of left in a very primitive style. And then, of course, the gestures, the positioning, it all feels kind of like quirky and off a little bit. Um, the same perhaps could be said of the other Vienna secessionist. What was his name? Gustav Klimt. Klimt did more kind of straightforward rendering of figures, but then he introduced these big general shapes in his compositions and these kind of simple patterns. Sometimes they were more sophisticated, but I think he too was interested in this kind of direct visual aesthetic that was more honest, that was more truthful, that was more potent, less mediated by um, education and culture and normality. So I wanted to include some of these cave paintings in here, and there, you look at these, and there is something about it, right? You look at these representations of horses and people, um, buffalo and people hunting, and I don't know. For me, it's easy to kind of put myself in that situation, and if somebody in a cave, like their days are spent trying to find food, and the kind of urgency of that, the immediacy of that, and then they just, this person discovers that they can spit some chewed up chalk, or charcoal, and make shapes by spitting on their hand and making masks on the wall, and come up with something that kind of approximates what they're doing, right? And I can feel like what that might have felt like to see their drawing up on the wall, and like, that's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. Or, that kind of looks like me. So I think there's this kind of, I don't know. Again, this is part of what making art is all about. It's about expression. It's about communication. And I think also, there's other things about it, like, again, like being able to see ourselves in an image that's outside of ourselves. I think it's also a way that we just try to process our human experience and what's going on. So I think, again, there's this through line that ties all these different things together of primitive cave painting when they're just starting to figure out how to represent and communicate visually, in images. And then, this idea of a child's aesthetic and how that's untrained. It's more pure, it's more honest, it's more direct, it's more kind of at the ground level. And then also these mentally ill, it's mentally ill aesthetic, or appeal to the mentally ill, and how that could be less filtered, less bound by rules and convention, more honest, more truthful, more powerful, right? I mean, it's like there are a lot of similarities in all of this stuff. So okay, so let's move on to somebody who perhaps you might be more familiar with. This is somebody who you would expect to see in pretty much every museum in the world. I mean, you'd expect to see Paul Klee and Dubuffet, but they'd be in the like permanent collection, kind of in a back room. But somebody who's more contemporary, and that you might find in the brand new contemporary wing, you walk in and there's this massive painting, and it looks like this, right? And here's where it's very easy to look at that and say, oh my gosh, my kid could do that. That looks exactly like what what my 2-year-old is scribbling on a piece of paper, right? But this is like a 9 foot by 12 foot either piece of paper or painting. I think this is probably smaller than that, but he does very large work as well. So my kid could do that, right? And it's said in a way that's supposed to be dismissive, right? It's like, that's horrible. Why are we holding this up as culturally significant, right? As a representation of high achievement. And I want to suggest to you that there's something there. Not everything on a museum wall needs to be a Monet, right? Not everything needs to be a Sargent or a Seurat, right? Like, I'm thinking of like the Impressionists, because everybody likes the Impressionists, right? You go to a museum and it's the Impressionist wing that is chock full of people. Picasso and Braque, not many people in those rooms. So not every that's kind of the beautiful thing. It's like not everything needs to be those things. That there's something here. Perhaps a kid could do some of this, but they didn't. An adult did this purposefully, intentionally. We're trying to accomplish something here. We're trying to explore something here. And you look at this, and if you can get past that kind of initial reaction and dismissal of, oh, a kid could do that, just let yourself absorb that. Okay, fine, fine, a kid could do that, right? Let's take that as a given. Um, is there something worth looking at here? Is there something worth exploring or understanding? Is there something that might help inform how I make marks, how I make my art, how I communicate, how I express myself, right? Is there something here? And my feeling has always been with when I see Cy Twombly's, I always go up and there's something there where I'm like, wow, there is an authenticity, there's a directness, knowing that it was an adult man, an adult that did this, makes it something completely different than if it were a child that did this, right? I think Cy Twombly is trying to tap into that directness, that honesty. And I think if you're if you're an artist who spent a lot of time in a studio, a lot of time with a pencil in your hand or a brush in your hand, you know that there are different kinds of marks. There are some marks that look forced, that look careless, that look rude and kind of unrefined. There are other marks that look really competent, that look fresh, that don't look overworked or gone over and over, that don't look tentative or shy, right? There's all sorts of different kinds of marks. And the more you make marks, the more you realize that it can be really hard to make a good mark. A mark that looks truthful, that looks authentic, that looks direct and powerful. I'm going to turn off, I keep on getting these notifications. I forgot to turn off or turn on Do Not Disturb. So hopefully nothing personal popped up there on my screen. Um, so so that's what I would suggest to you. And I think, especially with Cy Twombly, seeing some of these up large, blown up and in your face. So something like this, I believe there are some of these works in LACMA, if I'm not mistaken. But these are just big paintings, and it looks like a lot of paint on a fairly big brush, and he just did something like this, right? So I look at Cy Twombly, and he's experimenting with language, so having some words in there, or partial words, or just letters that kind of make an appearance in, let's see, in his drawings and paintings. Little scribbles, big scribbles, scribbles that have been erased or brushed out, things that look like he's making some kind of chart or there's some kind of order to it. And again, I don't think there is an order to it. I think it is just him experimenting with these marks in this language and trying to understand it and trying to control it and do it in a way that feels real, that feels honest, authentic, powerful, etc. All right, so, don't look at this and toss it aside because it's not Monet, right? It's not trying to be Monet, right? That's not what's trying to be communicated. That's not what's being explored. And I do think there is something here that's worth learning from and worth spending time with. And I think he was very good at it. I think he was very good at exploring these modes of expression and doing it in a way that felt real and powerful and authentic and all of these things. So he was able to convincingly be childlike and do it in a way that was compelling. All right, so a couple more artists here that I think are worth mentioning along this line. Kai Altoff is an artist, illustrator, I believe, and also had this collective of artists and friends that would hang out and play music. And some of the friends were accomplished artists, very good, obviously had rendering abilities and good at drawing and painting, and some were not. And then sometimes the people that were good at drawing and painting, in a more traditional, realistic way, chose not to render that way, chose to render in kind of more simple, cartoony, comic-y, illustrative modes. I think he's really interesting. I really enjoyed. There was a retrospective of his work and installations of some of the collaborative stuff that I found really compelling. Um, so you look at a drawing like this, and it communicates. It expresses on a level that is completely different. It just is a different sentence. It's a different song. It's a different expression than what you would get from, somebody who's doing a more traditional, straightforward oil painting on linen portrait, right? And it's just something totally other. Another person that or artist that I wanted to bring up that I have found very compelling and interesting. Um, this is Arnold Fryner. He would do things like this. I believe these are, and I could be getting this wrong, but I believe these are photographs taken of people in mental institutions, people that were um, not of a sound mind. And he would do these printouts, and I think he also took pictures of himself doing these kinds of gestures and facial expressions. And then he would just take pencils, charcoal, I'm sure oil, pastels, or something, and he would just start making marks on these facial expressions in these different pictures. And I think there is a lot there, again, to learn from. And I think he's trying to do a similar type of thing. He's trying to tap into or respond to or interact with, have a conversation with that very raw and direct and powerful kind of expression and emotion. In this case, the expression is captured via photograph. And then he's trying to respond to it or react to it or interact with it by doing a direct mark making on that surface. So I've always, looking at some of these photographs, I just think they're quite instructive and compelling. And again, trying to get at this thing, right? Or there's one here where he kind of gouges at the eyes. I'm not seeing it. I've got a book of his work, and I think that might actually be him. Like right here, he would do a lot of them would have these. He would go straight for the eyes and kind of scrub little circles on the eyes. It was almost an act of aggression, right? And I don't think it necessarily was an act of aggression toward the person that was in there. I think again it was this kind of response to that emotion, and trying to capture that in a mark, in again a dialogue between this expression that's represented in the photograph, and then how he would then express himself with charcoal on that image. All right, so again, somebody who's appealing to or interested in trying to study, trying to understand, trying to tap into perhaps that raw and direct emotion that's present in the mentally ill. There is another kind of focus and obsession with these kinds of representation that are naive, that are childlike or uncultured, untrained, and it's that would be the whole kind of idea of outsider art. I'm sure you've heard about it, but essentially, outsider art is art created by anybody who wasn't trained, right? In a kind of traditional way. And that's a lot of different artists, a lot of different galleries. There are whole art conventions that are created to display outsider art. And again, I think it's trying to tap into this same idea that we see all the way back through art history in these different forms, but it's all trying to get at the same thing. We're trying to express ourselves in a very direct, we want to see in the image how we actually feel. We want, I'm sure you've had the experience where you're having a conversation and you just can't find the words to express what your experience was, right? You saw an awesome sunset, and nothing you say can quite capture the grandeur or how awesome that sunset was or whatever the experience might be. And I feel like a lot of artists have that experience in the studio. We're making artwork, we're making lines, combining colors, uh, representing things, and sometimes there's that feeling like this just doesn't feel true. It's not capturing, it's not saying what I want it to say. And I feel like a lot of this is trying to get at that, that feeling, wanting to be more authentic, to be more truthful, wanting to figure out how to capture this, the rawness, um, the I don't know, the human level of this feeling, and put that into some kind of image. So outsider art is one of those things. This is just a Google for outsider art. There's tons of different things, but they all share that in common. There's this unfiltered, untrained feeling to it. Grandma Moses is somebody who's comes up a lot in kids' art classes or in art history as somebody who is, again, this outsider kind of aesthetic, untrained, simple, naive, unaffected by the norms of an art school or by trends. This is something real. Like, it's her. She didn't have to care that anybody was going to say anything about it. She just did it for herself, right? Another person that comes up along those lines is Basquiat. I think he was probably more trained and more conscious of contemporary art in the art world than, say, somebody like Grandma Moses or other outsider arts. But I think in the same vein, he is trapped into an aesthetic that represents life experience that cannot be represented in more traditional modes. He's using colors, he's using symbols and words in a way that expresses something that can't be expressed any other way, right? I think you look at a Basquiat like in person in life, up large on the wall, and there's a power in them that is very unique, feels very truthful and authentic. And again, I think it's worth your consideration. There are things to learn from that. There's a unique experience and person behind that artwork that's worth trying to connect with. That's going to make your understanding of the world bigger, and that's when art is great. The final artist that I'm going to invoke here, and it looks like my video is going in and out of connection here, so hopefully this is not too torturous. But the last artist I want to mention here isn't really brought up necessarily in these same vein, but I think she taps into, I don't know, in my mind, she's very much connected to everything that I've been talking about today. And that is Dana Schutz. Her paintings, I'm going to bring this one up, open image in new tab. Let's take a look at that. So Dana Schutz, she does these kind of mythic genre paintings, these large scale, like Last Man on Earth, or I'm not remembering all the names of her different series, but there's definitely she's using kind of illustrative, cartoony, some of these similar types of really dramatic expressions or vacant eyes or kind of limbs being bent in the wrong ways, kind of a tortured type of rendering. She's using kind of rude color palettes. Sometimes her color palettes are often beautiful and very, quite sophisticated. I think they're lovely. But again, something like this, let me open this up in a new tab. So this person is either has feet for hands, or their hands are down below and they're using their foot to manipulate whatever that is. And this person's got these straight, rigid black arms coming out. So very simplified types of forms. These clouds in the background look very graphic. They're evenly separated. They almost look like clip art. And then there's, they're doing surgery on this green figure on the table that looks very dead, very morbid, and all these different things that are kind of falling to pieces there. Um, so again, not exactly the same thing, but I think in my mind, at least, all of these things are tied together. Um, so I think that's to the close of everything that I had to say, and kind of the through line that I wanted to present for you. Naive art, primitivist art, art brute. My kid could do that. Maybe all of these things are true. But I think what is untrue and unhelpful, and perhaps just not an attitude or a perspective that's going to be very helpful to you, is to say all of that to dismiss something so that you don't have to interact with it or consider it or look at it or learn from it. To kind of just use that as a way to turn a blind eye to that whole side of visual art and creativity. And I don't think this is just a visual art thing, although I kind of feel like it's, that statement, my kid could do that, is kind of has its own meaning and potency in relation to visual art, right? Because it's something that we hear perhaps on movies and TV shows and, in gallery stuff specifically for it, but I think it ties into something much larger. So I would just challenge you to, I don't think you have to like it. I don't really care much for Grandma Moses paintings. I think there's better outsider art out there to learn from. I love Dana Schutz. I love Cy Twombly. You don't have to like it, but I guess the conclusion of my rant and my presentation here is that it deserves to be there. It's good that it is. It makes us better. There is something to learn from that, and I believe there is a very important and truthful sentiment in there of, learning from those in our life, those in this world that aren't fettered by the pretenses and the systems that we have in play that kind of keep us from making connections that are potentially available to make us better, to push the human race forward, right? Like sometimes we learn stuff from kids, they don't have the same assumptions. They haven't been trained in the same way. So why would you close yourself off from the opportunity to learn from that part of the human family, right? Or from people who are mentally ill or have different challenges. Maybe I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to glorify mental illness or say that it exists, but it's there, right? It's these human beings are important parts of our existence and opportunities for us to connect and learn how to express ourselves more compellingly, more directly, more authentically, honestly, and more powerfully. Right? So just, I guess the point here is don't off from all of that, potential to learn and push yourself and add to your ability to communicate and express. Anyway, I tend to be a little bit too chatty, maybe saying the same thing over and over again. Apologize if I was a bit redundant in all of this, but hopefully that was informative and entertaining in some way. Again, this is the live critique on Thursdays, 11 a.m. They are available for you to watch as recordings after the fact, but I would love it if you would show up live. I love having people there. It makes me feel like I'm not just talking to myself in my garage, which is basically what I'm doing. I'm glad that you're there. Normally, ideally, my Thursdays, this broadcast would be primarily talking about your work. If you have artwork, and it, again, doesn't have to be accomplished, doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be finished. If you could use some feedback to give you some responses, just so you know if what you're doing is working or if you're struggling with something in particular, or if you don't know what you're struggling with, but you know something's not quite right and just need somebody to give you a little push, or ideas, different perspective. That's what I'm here for. I love to talk about art. I love to see what you're up to, um, and especially would love to focus on what's happening right now, either current work that you're working on or recently finished. And you can also check out more information about classes I offer. Right now, I'm doing a resin techniques class, which is awesome. I love resin. I love sharing how cool it is and what just the awesome stuff you can do with it. Registration is closed on that, but more classes will be offered soon. So you can check all of that out at Dabbleon, DABBLEON.com. Also, you can sign up for my email list there. And very soon I plan to announce more ways of taking classes with me or connecting with me in critique groups or with private one-on-one critiques. Keep an eye out for that. And again, if you want to be informed when all of these things happen, make sure you sign up for my email list at dabbleon.com. And with that, I will sign off for today. Hope everybody's well. I'll stick around for a little while after. Actually, I'll take a look at the chat on Facebook real quick before I end here.